All right, kids, gather around. Daddy's got a new. Oh my god. Yeah, let's not do that. Let's not call me Daddy. Do you think if I change my Tarot channel name to Tarot Daddy, I'll get 10,000 subscribers at some point? Hey, I got a book to sell. Anyway, hi, that's neither here nor there. I have a video to make for you today, and I'm making it right now. So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to talk about the art and science of interpreting. I will use tarot as sort of the main metaphor, but I'll also talk a little bit about astrology, which I'm not an expert in, but a lot of what I've learned about how to talk about interpreting comes from astrology. And I'll also just use some other examples, maybe an oracle deck. Do I have an oracle? Yeah, I do. So interpretation, right? So let me sort of describe my learning experience as a tarot reader for you, and it may ignite similar experience, right? You may have had a similar experience. So I got into tarot. I bought a book. I bought a lot of books, and I just read a lot. I absorbed a lot, and I tried to learn the meanings of the cards. And I did that partly through memorization, partly through just trying to read a lot, and partly through working with the images, which is one reason why I struggled so much to find a deck that I really liked, because, I wasn't really sure, like, if the imagery wasn't, I'm just checking my volume here, the imagery wasn't, like, attractive, then I didn't sort of want to work with it, and then, like, that became difficult. So that was one of the first obstacles, was, like, I didn't not like the Waite-Smith deck, I think. I think I hated the color tones, the color saturation, and even, like, the more, or the better-looking ones they weren't quite as, like, saturated as I want. Anyway, doesn't matter. Point is, had a hard time with the visual imagery in some cases, and, just a lot of, like, it was tough. It was tough to learn. So I did that, visual images, and then I also remember taking, like, a notebook. It was like a sort of steno-sized notebook, but really thick. And I just wrote down my kind of interpretation of each card, right? My understanding or my remembered meaning of each card. And then over time, I'd sort of transitioned from using books to using that notebook, and then eventually put the notebook away. And then I would just start doing readings because I knew how to read, right? And I don't think that I understood that was part one, right? That was act one of learning how to read tarot or read anything, really. I don't think I understood that, like, that's the first phase, and that there are additional phases, which today I know because I've been through it, and also I work, in adult learning. So I have a sense of how people learn. And even though I was still, I sort of started in the world of adult learning at about the same time that I started learning tarot. In fact, I got my first job in training and development through through teaching a course on tarot, for my coworkers, which was objectively, in retrospect, sort of braver than I thought it was. But at the moment, it just seemed like, well, I'm learning this, I might as well teach it. I went like that for a long time. It was fine. I did good readings. But I don't think I thought I was interpreting. I don't know what I thought. Maybe I did think I was doing that. I think everything was fine as long as I felt good about the reading and I got validation. And I think if it wasn't fine, or I knew that it wasn't fine if I didn't feel good about it and I didn't get validation. Or what I had said, like, had no connection to the person I was reading for, which at that time was almost always friends. Blah, 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 blah. That's how I learned, right? And that's where I thought learning ended. What I didn't realize, and what I know now, and actually my first two books are inspired by this very idea, is that to take that foundation, to take that framework, and transform it into divination, transform it into reading, requires interpretation, and that's where things get difficult for new readers, right? Is the interpretation, particularly when an array of cards can make sense. An array of cards doesn't connect to the question, if there is one, or don't connect to each other, or don't sort of make sense given what's going on in your life, for example. or the life of the person you're reading for. And so it's at that point where we realize, a lot of us realize that, well, maybe we don't even realize anything. I think the first thing we do is all right, I'm speaking very broadly here. I said I would start with my experience. What I did was I got down on myself. That's how I interpreted that, as just not being a very good reader. Here's another thing I'm bad at. Here's another thing no one will love me for. And that's how I would approach it, rather than understanding that I wasn't done yet, that I wasn't finished learning yet, and I wasn't finished with the reading yet. So when I would approach a spray of cards that didn't seem to make sense, then rather than keep digging, I would get frustrated and I would give up. And when I read for me, sometimes I still do that, because I'm very lazy when it comes to reading for myself, which is annoying, but less so over time. And when I write down readings for myself, I have a better time. But anyway, interpretation is not a recitation of card meanings. And I think a lot of folks, when they're starting out, struggle with understanding that, with accepting that, and with the reality that we may not be cooked yet. We may not be done yet as readers, right? Because in modern life, we need to go from 0 to 60, in 2.3 seconds. We need to go from, neophyte to expert immediately, right? From bachelor's degree to doctorate in a year or less. From frontline to the CEO suite, in a few weeks. This is very, millennials and Gen Zers get the blame for this. For expecting to come into a job and jump from, frontline to CEO within a year, right? And there's this sense of entitlement, but that's not millennials or Gen X's fault. That is what we taught them to expect. Because for older generations, I'm sort of late stage Gen Z, born in the late 70s. And the everyone loves generational conversation. The boomer generation, we created that space, and it was already happening for Gen X, because we didn't grow up necessarily with the participation trophies, although late, some of us later in life did. But what we got was, you can be anything, right? Because that had been true for moneyed white men up until that point in this country, right? And we just sort of started, equality meant telling everybody that, even though it wasn't true. And so why do Gen Z and millennials have a reputation for wanting to go from 0 to 60? Because that's the story we told them to expect. And it's very American, it's very sort of United States, it's very bootstraps, it's very bullshit. It's very bullshit. And that's not how learning or getting good at anything goes. You know what I mean? And certainly that's not how we divine. We don't connect with divinity easily, right? It takes time. So when I say the art and science of interpretation, what do I mean by that, right? Well, what I mean is taking the recitation of card meanings into the interpretive act of reading. And you're doing this already, even if you're working with just memorized card meanings. You are. But it's taking it deeper. From Daddy and Jesus. Ignore me. That part, not this part. I'm just losing it. It's been a long year. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the art of interpretation. So yes, you're already doing it, but it's about taking it deeper. There's two tracks. There's the art and the science. Let's start with the science first. The science I would call the structure, or the basic foundation of how to do an interpretive moment, right? Regardless of what you're interpreting. Okay? It's a bit like math. And I think Tarot on Earth, if you haven't read my book, Tarot on Earth, it kind of centers on this idea of the math, right? The science of interpretation. And so what we've got, I have my box of charms here, and I want to get them out of the way because I want to put my elbows down. What I mean by the science of interpretation is that we have it's like a math equation, as I was saying. Sorry, I'm much more scattered than I thought I was today. It's like a math equation. So we have the card. We have the card's meaning as learned. We have the other cards. And we've got then the variables, right? Well, I guess the other card, all of these are variables, but the main variables are the reader, the context, meaning the question or not question, and the client or querent if they're different from the reader, right? So we've got card meaning, we've got other cards, we've got the variables of contexts, including reader, querent, question or not. And then we also have kind of the mood or the vibe at the moment. These are like the 5 foundational interpretive elements that make up a reading. Now, you could break that out differently. That's fine. And I might, if I were writing this out, say it a little bit differently. I don't have notes. I'm speaking like I usually do in these videos, extemporaneously. But those are the things, right? Card meaning, other cards, the contexts and variables, the mood, all of those things are the elements of interpretation. Oftentimes in readings, some pieces of those won't be congruent, to use another mathematical term, right? They won't seem to make sense together. And that's where we struggle. And that's where the art comes in. So recognizing the science is that there's a framework, all right? I've got this specific series of informations. I've got these data. That will tell me something, but it doesn't tell me everything. The art of it is taking those and figuring out how they fit together to yield a mathematical sum. The difficulty, though, is unlike math, there's only one right answer. When we're looking at interpretation, there's many, many answers. Many of them are possible. We tend to think that there's a right answer. And there may be, but oftentimes life is more chaotic than that. And so I talk about this a lot lately, this idea of dialectics. Dialectics meaning that two seemingly opposing things can be true without canceling each other out. True at the same time without canceling. Life is really full of like trialectics and quadilectics. There's many, many things that are happening and can be true at the same time. The Ace of Swords can represent a new idea. And it's also true that it can represent the severing of ties, right? Those are both things that are true. And they can be true about the card at the same time, but they cannot be true about the card at the same time in a reading unless there's enough context for both of those. So let's start simple. Interpreting is sort of thinking about each of those science facts as a filter that we're pulling the information, we're pulling the data through. And weirdly, to simplify this, I'm going to start with astrology, which is very unlike me. But I spent a lot of late last year, early this year, just kind of going on a dive with astrology, just sort of seeing what I could learn and retain. And I read a lot, and one of the things I read that was the most helpful is this book here. This is the Contemporary Astrologers. I hate when the blur does this, but it's the Contemporary It looks like I'm just trying to get. There we go. The Contemporary Astrologer's Handbook by Sue Tompkins. And I really like Sue Tompkins' books. She also wrote a book on astrological aspects, which was excellent. But this book, if you're looking for a primer on astrology, I would 100%. It is clear. It is easy to understand. It makes sense. And the things that she talks about, including interpretation in this book, are really, really helpful. When you think about interpreting an astrological chart, my cadences are all weird today. An astrological chart, what we're thinking about in many ways is pulling information, just like I said, pulling information data through a lens. So in astrology, we have the lens of a sign, a house, and a planet, in addition to other lenses of aspects and that sort of thing, right? Aspects are the angles. So my sun sign is in Leo in the 7th house, and directly across from that is my rising sign in Aquarius in the 1st house. And so that's the aspect, that's the angle is a straight line, they're opposing, so my opposing aspect, right? So those are aspects. So let's use what I just gave you as an example, right? So we have the combination, so I have my sun sign Leo in the 7th house. And so that's I've got my sun sign is Leo. My sun is in its own sign. So that's a context. And then they're in the 7th house. And the 7th house is one of partnerships and relationships. And so if I were interpreting my own chart, and actually one of the big struggles that I found in working with my own chart and in having others describe my chart to me is that the 7th house really has very little meaning to me. It never makes sense to me. And so that's a thing that I struggle with, because an important part of my chart, my sun sign, and my sun sign is in its own sign, the sun is in Leo, is in a house that makes no sense. And that may represent kind of a lifelong struggle, right? I don't necessarily struggle with partnerships or friendships, but I do struggle with my desire to be solitary in many ways, and also to be, a social creature. So maybe there's a little bit of that going on, you know what I mean? But anyway, the point is, to understand those three things, I need to pull... The sun sign represents what Sue Tompkins says in this book, which is really, really beautiful, and really actually kind of helps me understand the seventh house a little bit more, is that our sun sign isn't who we are, it's who we're becoming. And I loved that. That was a context that opened things up for me. So my sun sign is who I'm becoming. My sun is in Leo. Leo's a sign of, we think of it as confidence, we think of it as, theatricality, egotism, all things that I'm guilty of. But that haven't always necessarily yielded the most healthy results for me either. In part because of my relationship to others. And because so much of I'm like having a realization as I'm recording this, so much of my sense of self depends on what I think other people think of me. So there, I just solved that equation. Live. Well, it's not live, but you know what I mean? Like, that is a thing that's real. And so one might argue, an astrologer might say, that my journey in life to becoming is learning both to develop relationships that aren't based on my own ego, but also to validate my own ego in ways that don't rely on other people, on external validation, right? So maybe that's where that goes. Brilliant, brilliant. I should obviously be an astrologer. I'm just kidding. All right, well, true to form, my computer fucked up while I was making this video, so luckily I managed to save the first 20 minutes of it, so now you're going to see me keep going, but I don't quite have the flow I had before, and given that I was already kind of scattered, let's hope for the best, shall we? All right, what was I saying? So you saw my little sort of version of working through my interpretation of my sun sign in my natal chart, given that it's in the 7th house. Much more could be said about that, but that's not really the point. The point is, like, that's the art part of this, right? The science is the formula. So it's context plus context plus context plus context, whatever those contexts are. And then the art of it is fitting those pieces together, almost as though filtering them through each other, right? So in the example that I did, I had my sun filtered through my sign, Sun in Leo in the 7th house. So Sun in Leo filtered through the 7th house. And then that sort of filter yields the interpretation that I came up with, which is about my tendency to base my relationships on validation. So that's the art of it, right? Now, not every astrologer, maybe not any astrologer, would come up with that, because maybe I'm not understanding the 7th house. Well, that's not really, again, the point, right? The point isn't getting it right. Because I think that this is another place where we start to get really hard on ourselves, and where we start to get mean to ourselves, and where we start to get away from divining and more into self-flagellation, which is when we start comparing and sort of looking for approval, for validation in our interpretations, right? So here's where then, like, someone will lay out a spread for themselves, kind of lazily interpret it, throw it in a forum and say, well, here's what I think, what do you think? And then everyone says, oh no, that's wrong, here's what it is. For me, other people's opinions of what a spread says are interesting, but they have nothing to do with the reading. They are merely interesting because the contract was signed by that reader and that deck and that spirit divinity, like whatever you want to think about it as, right? So your post-game commentary on someone else's reading is just that. It's just post-game commentary. You were not called in to play the game. You were not called in to pinch hit. You know what I mean? You weren't called in to replace the starter, right? You are merely a commentator on the sidelines. Maybe you have a lot of experience with divination, and maybe you're particularly well qualified to comment on it, but because you were not there at the time the contract was signed by which I mean when the querent and the reader chose the topic, shuffled the cards, and laid them out, your interpretation is interesting but invalid, if that makes sense. And that may sound really mean. It's not. You were not there, part of the energy of the reading. So if you want to coach someone in that environment, the best thing you can do is ask open-ended questions to help them understand what they could have done or did do well, right? So instead of saying, well, here's what I think the cards mean, you could say, well, this isn't a question, but talk to us about how you arrived through that decision. What techniques did you use to land there? What contexts or what symbols did you consider? How important is this detail to you? That kind of open-ended question inspires a student, inspires a learner, inspires another reader to consider their own process, not to subliminally feel less than, which is inevitably what happens in that kind of context, because you are announcing to anyone within earshot that you would like their expertise, but not everyone's an expert, and no one was there when you signed the contract with the reading. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, if you want to do share readings with each other, that's great. Do it. You know what I mean? But don't say, here's what I think this should mean. Ask questions about what it means to the person who interpreted it, because they're the one who signed the contract. So in a forum like that, the best thing we can do for each other is ask questions and guide each other to a deeper answer, which is essentially the same thing that we do for ourselves when we're reading for ourselves, right? We should be asking ourselves these kinds of open-ended questions as well. And that's part of the art of it, is like, okay, I'm just going to pull 3 cards, right? Let's just do that for the sake of whatever. I'm not even going to shuffle that dramatically. I'm just going to pull 3 cards. They're going to be blurry when I show them to you anyway, because I have the blur on and I can't remember how to shut it off. So let's see. We've got Death. We've got the 4 of Swords, and we've got the 8 of Pentacles. I'll throw a picture in here of these cards later, but I can't take that picture now because I'm using my phone as a camera and everything is crazy. So Death, 4 of Swords, 4 of Pentacles. Again, these are the cards in this order. They're going to be backwards. Well, I guess maybe they're not backwards, but they are going to be blurry. This is the Supernova Tarot, which I did a review of. I was kind of hard on it. I really love it. I love its queerness. I wish it were more diverse in terms of body type, ethnicity, ability, etc. So what I'm doing is I'm sort of like looking at these cards, and I'm just sort of like going through like a series of emotional experiences, right? Oh, fuck, like the death cards here, I'm going to die. Oh, fuck, I don't know how to do this. Oh, fuck, these cards don't go together. Oh, fuck, I should have asked a question and I didn't. Let all of that vent out. Okay, and then I start thinking about what's my formula? What's my math in this particular reading? So, my card. So I start with the math of the first card. My first card is Death. So that's card number 1. Then I think about the other cards, 4 of Swords, 8 of Pentacles. Now, this is a 3-card reading. I'm probably going to do a version of this each time, by which I mean I'm looking first at the Death card in the context of the 4 and 8. But later on, I'll look at the 4 in context of Death and the 8. And later on, I'll look at the 8 in context of the 4 and Death. I may need to do that for each card. I may not. This is why it's an art and not a science, because it's a little bit of a dance between sort of knowing and not knowing, following a path and straying from it. Because this is a reading without a question, I have less contextual guidance to go on, but I still have context. So what do I know? Well, I know, when I'm looking at it, that the context of the cards is that the Death seems to be leaving the other 2 cards. The 4 of Swords is very sort of static, and the 8 of Pentacles is at work, but looking in the other direction. And so both cards are sort of moving away from, or looking away from, the 4. All right, so that's a context. May or may not be useful, but it's a context that I can use in interpretation. And that's why I may not have to go through the context of each three or the relationship of each three to the other two, because what I'm really doing is just sort of experiencing, right? Like, this is the act. Interpretation begins with knowing your formula and then sort of going into the art gallery and just seeing the Rothko and letting that just sort of spill over you, and like, ooh, what do these reds make me feel? What are these, these containers of red make me feel? Why do they bleed on the edge? You know what I mean? So it's just experiencing the cards, right? I'm not forcing them into an answer yet. I'm not telling them what they mean. I'm not saying the death means endings. The Four of Swords is kind of a dead image, so here we have a memorial, and then we have the Eight of Pentacles, so this is a story about someone building a memorial. Maybe it is, but it's not there yet. So I'm just experiencing the cards. What am I saying? What am I saying? What am I feeling? I've got swords, I've got pentacles, I've got majors. No wands, no cups. What else is, like, curious to me? The four in the middle, is this interesting combination of, like, a jester and a knight. You see, like, they've got kind of armor, but they're also, it looks kind of like they're wearing a suit jacket and then, like a neck ruff, and then a hood. So there's like a weird. There's like I'm not quite sure who this person is, but I see someone kind of at peace with that, sort of at peace with not knowing who they are, and with sort of trying on a different. Or like pieces of different uniforms and just putting them on and then meditating. So like a story starts to form, right? And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. Now, what is that relevant to? I don't know. I mean, it's certainly something I've experienced in the older I get, I don't know. So I'm like, I could panic, I could stop, I could freak, or I could just keep going. And keep sort of experiencing the cards. Keep asking myself open-ended questions. Keep thinking about the formula, but not being bound by the formula. You know what I mean? So cards in context to each other, cards in context to the question and the querent and the reader, the mood that's sort of vibing at the moment, and anything else that kind of comes up. My own vibe today has been pretty low-key, although when my computer crashed, I got really pissed. And I'm very quick to getting pissed these days. But that isn't contextually relevant. I guess that's just interesting information for you. So the death is such a powerful image. So I go to look at this card, and it's interesting because this card kind of reminds me back of that show in the 80s where the guy used to wear like the suit, like the spandex suit with all the body parts inside of it, or on it. You know what I mean? It's sort of giving that vibe. And there's obviously the scythe, and there's a crown, and there's this beautiful steep angle. Death is climbing uphill. It's an uphill battle. Death to me, so here's where, like, this card isn't necessarily jiving, so here's where I'm going to return to my foundation. What do I know about this card? What do I know about what death means? I think about death as inevitability in my case frequently. So it's not so much that death is an ending, it's an inevitability, because we don't know what comes after that, for sure. So, yes, it can mean an ending, it can mean a death, it can mean a stoppage. It's often a punctuation mark, but for me it tends to mean inevitability. That doesn't feel contextually relevant here, though, especially given its position and the way it's leaving the reading, in a way. I see, as I just experienced this, I see that Four of Swords almost meditating on what they've had to leave behind. What they've had to give up or cut from their life. I see kind of the internal reckoning of that, and I'm now experiencing the visual rhyme of the sword and the scythe, both as cutting instruments. And so I see this person sort of just saying, here's what I've had to leave behind, here's what I've had to give up. And that is a thing that I've experienced. I've talked about this a little bit. I over the years I may have mentioned, I was going to school for a master's degree in playwriting. I really was dedicated to the craft of playwriting. I love writing plays. I love writing for the theater. I cannot work in the theater anymore. I cannot deal with the bootlicking. I cannot deal with the predatory behavior. I cannot deal with the narcissism. I cannot deal with the racism, with the body shaming, with the egos, with the unresolved mental health issues. All of the theater industry at the local and national level is increasingly poisonous to me. And I don't like that, because I love making theater, but it's not healthy for me anymore. And that's hard, because I not only dedicated a lot of my life to it, I dedicated a lot of money to it. I've never really made money as a playwright. I've gotten paid, but that's a drop in the bucket compared to the price of printing scripts, the price of sending out submissions, the price of school, the labor and time that went into sending out submissions, even in some cases to schmoozing, right? Like, I dedicated my entire adult life to this, and now I'm realizing I can't be part of it anymore because I am no longer willing to sacrifice my well-being to it. And that's hard, it's tough. Because I love it, but I don't love it. I love it in theory. I love the ideal of it, but I don't love the reality of it. I don't love how almost every experience I've ever had with it has demanded that I make myself smaller, that I make myself unseen and unheard, that I silence my understanding of behavior that's problematic. And even that I've said things, I'm very lucky that I haven't done necessarily things that I'm ashamed of, but I've certainly said things I'm ashamed of as a result of being in the theater. I very happily did not engage in predatory behavior, but I've been preyed on, and I've witnessed predatory behavior and said, well, that's just the art form. That's just the world we move in. You know what I mean? And now in retrospect, I think, gee, that's fucked up. Anyway, confessional. My own reality show right now. Anyway, contextually, that then hits me, right? That connects to me. So then I now know that this reading is talking about something contextually relevant to my life. And so whatever happens in the rest of the reading, I know I've sort of navigated my way through to a point of access, to a point of understanding what this reading is about, even without a question. And so far what I've got, in just looking at the first two cards, is this idea of this character in the 4 sort of navigating the spiritual realities, the mental and meditational realities of having decided, I have to cut the cord on these parts of my life. And it's a sustained phase, because swords are sustained. Now, I haven't spoken really at all about the traditional meaning of the 4 of Swords. By now, I don't really have one in mind. It's typically sort of rest from strife, right? Those are the keywords with the Golden Dawn. But that's not as important in this case. What's important is the sort of mental stillness in the card, and then the sustained nature of the 4. 4s are very sustained. And 4 is a powerful number in this reading, because death is 13, and 1 plus 3 is 4. Obviously the 4 of Swords. And then the 8 of Pentacles is 4 plus 4, or 4 times 2. So the base number of this reading is 4. So what this tells me is that this is a very sustained experience, a very slow meditation on the nature of work, on the nature of creativity, on the nature of the practical aspects of being a maker. And all of that comes from this card, from the 8 of Pentacles, right? The sort of vocational aspects of this card, the repetitious aspects of this card certainly underscore the 4. The practicalities of the Pentacles, the life realities, right? Not the idealisms. If this were the 8 of Cups, this would be the idealistic realities of making art. But in this case, it's the practical realities of it. And what doing that labor means, and remembering that it is labor, and that there should be a return on investment. And so the labor that I'm doing needs to be a return to my investment. It needs to be sustainable. Sustainable being 4 plus 4 in that 8, right? I need to do sustainable creativity. I can't do what I had been doing, which is the fiery, watery aspects, which is why they're not showing up in this spread. because my traditional relationship to creativity was fiery and watery. It was passion, it was spirit, it was chaotic, it was messy, it was big, it was bold. It was anything at any cost. I will do anything to succeed at this. Excuse me. That's not the case anymore. I need a practical path to sustainability. And so as I'm managing the maneuvering of this experience, the meditation of this experience, I need to use as my guidepost practicality and return on investment. And there's a reading. Quite a good reading, quite an important, powerful reading for me. And again, this is something I don't typically do for myself out loud. I usually write. But again, this is the art of interpretation, right? It is seeing the card or cards, seeing the card or cards in context to each other, seeing the card or context in context to the question or the life experience of the querent, the context of the mood or vibe of the diviner or the day or the event and even the querent, and then the variables of all of that as well. And from there, it's like walking through an art gallery and just experiencing the cards, just experiencing the feel and what I know about them, but not making them tell me anything yet. Just sort of saying, what do I feel? What do I notice? What am I experiencing? And that's how we move from recitation of memorized meanings into the art and science of interpretation. So it's literally just, it's experiencing. It's just noticing. Most of us, when we read, we lay out the cards and we say, death means endings. The Four of Swords means rest. Eight of Pentacles means work. Maybe. Right? But not yet. And that's kind of where my journey is as a reader drifts. Now, it's not always the same, and that's why it's an art and a science. Because it's not just a science. And the art, too, is that the act of interpretation really is there's the other filter that I didn't talk about, because you can't change it, is your life experience, is your cosmology, your worldview, your politics, your understanding of how the world functions, your understanding of oppression, your understanding of liberation, your understanding of relationships, your understanding of spirituality. All of these things are going to impact the way that your brain seizes on cards. And it's why two different readers can pull two different sets of cards and get the same answer for the same querent, or more or less the same answer. Even though if there are repeat cards, probably there's only one, right? But I have so many clients at events when I'm reading for a bunch of folks who say, you know, I just got a reading from a friend and that card showed up too. Or I just got a reading from a friend and I keep getting this message. You know what I mean? It's why. Even though the cards are different, the guides or whatever it is that makes this stuff work are using what's up here as much as what's down here, so that the cards that get laid out are more likely to trigger the thoughts that they would like us to land on, right? And so using a different deck may impact you differently. Using a different spread may impact you differently. Using, being in a different mood, calling on different guides, not thinking about God. You know what I mean? All of this is very, very unique to you and unique to the moment of the reading. And those are filters, too, that I think Divinity uses, or, again, however we think about what makes this work. Those are elements that contribute to the reading. We are, as readers, I think, being used by, in a healthy and somewhat sexy way, being used by Divinity to create a message, right? I always say the diviner is not the oracle, but we are part of the oracle, in the sense that we are being used by divination, because our own weirdnesses are going to dictate and communicate our triggers, our mental triggers, to whatever's out there, in order to have them arrange the deck in such a way that the cards that show up will trigger the right thoughts. And I don't think that there's a right card for every position. In fact, I think there are probably 3 or 4 cards that could very easily, and actually maybe not, there are probably 3 or 4 combinations of cards that every spread could be that would yield the similar answer. You know what I mean? Which is why it's not a science, and why, there may be a card every once in a while that doesn't seem to fit or doesn't seem as chatty, because, it's what came up. It was the closest match to the thing that needs to be said in that moment. for you at that time, based on your mood, based on your thought, based on all of that. So, I mean, I could go on, but what I'm really hoping is that this just gives you permission to keep digging and to sort of have the foundation, like begin with the foundation. Oh, I didn't have all the cards in here. Whoops. But to then sort of think, and in a way, this is what every video I've ever made, you know, has been about. You know, is doing this. But as I get older, I learn different ways to internalize. All right, third time. Here we go. Technology, man. I want to wrap this up. Obviously, it's gotten pretty long, shockingly. But I just wanted to show you a few other ways of thinking about this. So a three-card tarot reading is actually kind of a complex way of exploring what I was just saying. It doesn't need to be that. So I'll do an oracle deck, which is very rare for me. But I've got one in front of me here, and this is the Old Ways Magic Oracle by Naomi Kornok, which I think is stunningly beautiful. The thing for oracle decks with me and why I don't really like them is, in many ways, the concepts on them are too specific and harder to do what I just demonstrated with, right? They're a little limiting. And weirdly, the structure of tarot, which I thought was like a problem for me at one point in my career, actually is really beneficial. So whatever. But just sort of thinking about the reading I just did, I've chosen this card, Protection, the Bear. Come on, man. This deck is an absolute beauty. Really gorgeous. I don't think I've done a video on it. But so I have this image of a bear, and I have this word protection, right? And so I'm kind of not doing a general reading the way I was with the tarot cards, because I'm letting the tarot cards kind of indicate what this card, you know, it's contextualizing, it's containing this card, right? And so protection is a really apt card to show up here, because what it's reminding me is, in a way, kind of a ferocious self-defense. And that when I miss theater, you know, I have to remember that the ideal is what I miss. What I really need to do is protect myself from the reality, right? So again, I took this card and the image on it, and I filtered it through the theme of the reading before, you know, which is something that a lot of people will do to kind of wrap up particularly negative reading. Had I not done that tarot reading first, this would be really annoying. It wouldn't really give me much. Protect myself from what? There's a lot that I need to be protected from, right? So I could pull additional oracle cards, but even with oracle cards, you know, it's hit or miss whether a trio of oracle cards will yield the same kind of depth for me that a tarot reading would. But again, that's just a bias of my own, right? Because I just really like tarot. I mean, that's kind of what it comes down to. It's like there's nothing wrong with any other form of divination. I just am really good at tarot. And that's not bragging. I just really am, you know. And it's been a vocation in the sense that I have dedicated a lot of my time to it. Another thing we could do is charms, right? So or bones. So here's my. I've shown this before. Here's my bone kit. I don't really use this too much. But you know, when I do, I usually cast the whole set and I like fling it across a spread cloth. But in this case, I'm just gonna pick a few items. And then what have I got? Put these aside for a second. Now, normally the way that I when I cast them and I lay them out, the way that they fall on the chart sort of is part of how I read. But in this case, we're not worried about that. So I've got a treasure chest. I've got an acorn. I've got a rabbit. There's a little stone bunny rabbit here. Come on, focus on the rabbit. It's in portrait mode, so it's going to want to focus on people. But anyway, it's a little rabbit. I've got a bell. This is a fox foot bone, I believe. And I have a nutmeg. So here's a little salad of context. Now, just for my own ease, right, and for keeping this relatively short, I'm going to begin just by continuing adding to the thing I had already been talking about. But this is a little bit easier to start from scratch to me than an oracle deck, because you're working usually with like a lot of shit, and that creates a lot of context for you. The first thing I pulled out was the treasure chest, and it's open. This treasure chest can actually be closed, And it's like a little charm. There is a little latch that will close it, but it never really stays closed. But anyway, sometimes it falls closed. In this case, it fell open. So whenever I see an open treasure chest in a bone reading, it makes me think like your tank is empty, right? You've kind of given away your treasure. The rabbit is one that I'll think about in terms of fertility and speed. Like, again, depending on context, in like a relationship reading, this would be like really fast sex or potentially a baby, right? Rabbits are known to sort of reproduce a lot, and they move very quickly. In this case, I would say, with this context, it's like the treasure chest has been rapidly depleted. But because you're a naturally fertile person in the sense of creativity, if you can close the lid like the Four of Swords does, it'll refill relatively soon. The bell to me is always a warning, right? It's like, pay attention to this, pay attention to your tank being empty, pay attention to how rapidly you expend your energy, right? So it's sort of saying, look at this is important. So those are sort of the made things. And then we have two natural objects. Well, obviously the bone is natural too, but we have an acorn and a nutmeg. Nutmegs are typically associated with luck in a lot of spiritualities across the southern United States. They also, like a high John root in some traditions, can represent male genitalia, right? A testicle, or I should say cis male genitalia. It can represent anything round. It's also a spice, so it can represent anything spicy. It's a warm spice, right? So there's a calming, comforting quality to the nutmeg as well. An acorn is a seed, and the reason it's here is really for that reason. An acorn is a seed that you can see, right? So in a way, we could interpret this in a couple ways. These two, we could say that it's growing luck. We could say that luck is slow to come by. We could say, if this were a reading not for me, getting lucky, right? The testicle and the seed, ejaculation, right? And certainly there's a phallic nature to the bone too, so we could say that. And even if we just sort of, we could just get a little creative that way, I guess. And it could fall that way. There are times where things will fall that way, but a boner, right? That's not contextually relevant here, right? But it's interesting, and that's, again, we don't always necessarily get the great or the right idea the first time, but we get the ideas. A bone, for me, depends on the part of the animal where it come from, or where or what animal it is. And I think this is a foot bone. It's been a minute since I've actually used my kit, so I've forgotten what some of the bones are for. But we'll say that this is a foot bone, and to me that's just what it grounds you, right? It's the thing that keeps you on the earth. And so if we combine these three trinkets together, what we get is, it's a little bit harder to think about. So, I've got this depletion of my gifts, my energy. The seed connects to the depletion, right? Because we have to plant the seed. You know what I mean? If I think about the bone staying grounded, I think it's sort of a reminder to sort of not float away with idealism. You know what I mean? Like, keep your feet on the ground. You can keep your head in the clouds if you want to, but you got to keep your feet on the ground, right? So whatever you replace theater with, in my case, needs to be something that's grounding. And then the nutmeg isn't the loudest thing in the room, but I would say if you can do that, you'll find some luck in your career, right? The luck will start to come, wah, wah. But you'll start to see that if you can stay grounded while refilling your treasure chest, so to speak. So again, it's just kind of combining, and once you can do that, you can read anything. You don't even have to know how to do it. If you can do what I just did with the trinkets, with the bones, you can read Lenormand, you can read tarot, you can read playing cards, you can read Sibylla, because what you're doing is thinking about what is the object representational of. You know what I mean? A bone kit is a really intimate and personal way of doing a reading because you choose the things to interpret, right? You have selected them. You've curated your bone kit in order to sort of make it make sense to you. And so that's really powerful. But it's the same thing as reading a tarot deck. I love doing bone reading. I don't necessarily get different answers than I do with tarot. They're much longer readings. for me, so I don't do them more from a practical standpoint. It's not, when I go to an event, it's an exciting thing, but it's loud. It's messy. They fly everywhere. Like, it's just not an ideal way of reading for me. But the readings that I've done for myself have been really powerful. So that's interpretation. I hope, I don't have a Lenormand deck nearby. I don't think I do. My desk is utter chaos, right? It doesn't matter. It's the same thing. You know what I mean? Like, yes, there are books that tell you what the cards are supposed to mean. There are Lenormand readers that will tell you that the Tower is always an institution. For me, and this is thanks a lot to Camellia Elias, I don't read Lenormand that way. I do know what the cards mean. But what she encourages her students to do, and this really unlocked Lenormand for me, was to think about the function of the object. What is the function of a heart? Right? A heart has a job to do. It is not a representation of love. That is a cultural association of it. A heart is a pump that keeps our body moving, that keeps us alive. It's a pump. And so in a reading, it can have a pump-like action, which can be very sexual, but it can be motor, right? It could be love, but again, it's sort of like, what is it in context with? So context is something I've been talking about on this channel for years and years and years and years and years. But yeah. So that's interpretation, and I hope it helps. I hope it makes sense. So let me know what you think. Take care, be good, and we will talk soon, I hope. I need more video ideas.